everyone.
Good morning.
So we're excited. We have a wonderful lecturer with us today. Reverend Chelsea Yarborough is a PhD candidate at Vanderbilt University in homiletics and liturgics. She has a master's in divinity from Wake Forest, an undergrad degree from Elon. This is an exciting day for me, I will confess. Tonight, our preacher for revival is my kind of big sister vocationally, and my little sister is about to lecture today. So I'm excited to see what Chelsea has to offer in the way of a conversation about what is the Black church. We talked last week, we had this conversation about the resources that Black people need to deal with the kind of trauma of racism. And one of those resources becomes the church. And so Reverend Yarborough will offer for us a conversation about what happens in preaching, both as a resource and offer some critique. So please help me welcome Reverend Chelsea Yarborough.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good. So we're already in the practice of y'all talking back to me. So when I ask a question, I hope for answers. Can we agree to do that?
Okay.
Can we agree to participate? That's great. So I open up almost every lecture I do with this same invitation. And it's the invitation to all of us to risk learning. What do I mean by that? So often we enter into these spaces trying to prove what we know instead of being willing to actually learn and consider that which we don't know. So I invite you to risk being wrong, to risk not having the whole story, to risk actually asking yourselves the critical questions that I lift, because in that we can all learn, we can grow, we can consider the possibilities of Black preaching with one another. So can we agree to do that? Yes. Can we risk learning? Awesome. So my title for today is Looking In, Expanding Out, Black Preaching as a Window into the Black Church. Black preaching as a window into the Black church. So windows offer us perspective into something that walls would have otherwise shut us out of. Oftentimes, windows carve out a space of optical entry where a wall would have otherwise blocked our view. So this title, Looking In, Expanding Out, Black Preaching as a Window into Black Church Traditions, is simply saying that I'm trying to offer considerations that will hopefully expand and complicate your understanding of Black preaching, while noting that as our understanding of Black preaching expands, so does our understanding of Black church traditions. So today, my hope is that by the end of our brief time here together, you will feel invited to consider the ways in which your view of Black preaching may have been limited, and perhaps empowered to allow that view and perspective to expand. So that's the goal. So in order for us to have an idea if our perspective expanded or not, we need to begin with some questions, some primer questions. Let me move so you can see. I want you to take a moment and to write down your definition of Black preaching. Now, I'm not going to ask you to say it out loud, so you can, again, we're risking for yourself. Write it down. What is your definition of Black preaching? What are the distinguishing characteristics of Black preaching for you? Where have you seen or experienced Black preaching? I'm going to give you some moments to think about it. Put something down. I see some of y'all thinking, because I want you to, we're going to ask the same question at the end, so you can see for yourself if something has changed or expanded for you. How do you define Black preaching? What are the distinguishing characteristics for you? And where have you seen and or experienced Black preaching? All right, so in a similar lens of my initial invitation, oftentimes we enter into spaces deciding that we're coming in as blank slates, right? Like we forget that we are complex and complicated beings, and we also forget that everyone else is as well, but that's another lecture. So I want you to take a moment and look at what I'm calling frames of reference. These are some identifiers that impact the ways in which we see the world, one another, and certainly the way in which we see preaching and considering how much they impact the way you envision and define Black preaching. This is just some of them. There are plenty of other things. So if you think of another identifier that you think is more impactful, by all means write that down. This is for you. I want us to locate ourselves so that when we're hearing new things, we can actually move to another place and not just write them down as words, but also consider their effect on our actual lives. How does class affect the way you might see it? Work, your gender identity, cultural ability, place of origin, life experiences, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation. Another one someone says was their size as an identifier. So there are many, many different frames of reference. All right, we're good? Everyone got something written down? Cool, hold that for yourself. It'll come up towards the end, but also in your latter conversations as a group. Now, why is Black preaching a helpful window into the Black church? I felt like I should lay that out before going into some of the specifics. See, when I was growing up, there was like a million church services every Sunday. So I went to church at 7 a.m., I went to church at 10 a.m., sometimes I went to church at 3 p.m. And sometimes we were running late. But what I was often told was, as long as we make it for the sermon. So I grew up thinking, and that has since shifted, but I grew up thinking that everything else in the Black worship was setting up this preaching moment. And there was a tantamount in power and centrality of what the preaching moment was. And so I know that when we think through Black preaching, it opens up what we might think of as far as the Black church. From the beginning seeds of Black church experiences on the plantations and invisible institutions to contemporary Black churches and all of their multifacetedness, the pulpit is and was a place of power and influence. Preaching was an honor and a privilege, and was also a gift. A time for people who were otherwise demonized to be edified. A time to name that trouble does not last always. A time to consider what it might mean to live into the by, and by that what we consider to be right on the horizon. A time to proclaim in the here and now. Think about this. In a society that was oppressing Black people, dehumanizing and demeaning them at every turn, the Black church was a place where Black people had respect, held honor, and were able to claim their voice without the gaze of white people and impending trauma of racism that they experienced everywhere else. Boy became reverend on Sunday morning. The maid was a deaconess. The nanny was sister so-and-so, a leader of Christian education. In this paradigm, the pulpit is a place of honor, a place for the voice of God to speak through the preacher of God to the people of God. When talking about Black religion, W.E.B. Du Bois notes a three-part typology: the music, the preacher, and the frenzy. This characterization of Black church has been read too flatly without noting the nuances in all three of those categories. By adding more depth to how we look at Black preaching, we also then get insight and perspective into the multiplicity of what Black church can be. Too much of the depth of Black preaching's content and efficacy has been lost in the limited ways that it's taught in mainstream homiletics, seen as displayed on popularized TV, and talked about as if it's simply about a particular performance. With that in mind, there are two items that I hope to consider that I invite us to lean into, that we might expand beyond the simple understanding of the vastness of Black preaching traditions. Y'all still with me? Perfect. Window one, the issue of saying Black preaching versus saying Black preaching traditions. Now, in my initial question, I asked you, what is Black preaching? Did you think of just one thing? Too often, Black preaching has commonly been talked about as one thing. I told Professor Norton that I was at lunch as I was preparing for a lecture, and someone asked me what I was talking about, and I said I'm talking about black preaching, and their question to me was, are you going to teach people how to close? Are you going to teach people how to hoop or to do a particular type of performance? And I was like, oh, this is why I teach. Because this is the understanding of what we would even talk about when we talk about black preaching. And there's so much more. Too often, blackness, and therefore those things associated and connected to black, are flattened to that which has entertained white people. Too often, instead of thinking about the content, folks create a caricature of the black preacher. Black preaching is spoken of like a flat monolith, ascribed to a particular aesthetic and signified by whiteness. Why is that? Well, homiletician Henry Mitchell says, when a group of people is not considered important to a society, their history is not chronicled well. This doesn't simply affect the outsiders to a tradition, but insiders as well, to the sickness of a white gaze that tries to push what is multiple into a singular identity. Even more specifically, when society is signified and articulated through the lens of whiteness, then the descriptions of other groups become as simple as the dominant group needs them to be. So despite a popular understanding of black church, and therefore black preaching as one thing, the truth is that it is not simply false to poorly named black preaching, but it continues a process of historical dehumanization to not recognize the diversity within an expression of people. So I'd like to lift 3 realities of black preaching that will hopefully convince you to talk about black preaching in the plural and not the singular. I'll also name that I'm moving back and forth between black preaching and black preaching traditions. So when I say black preaching, add the traditions on in your head, because I'm talking about it in the multiple form. So first, to consider black preaching to be a tradition and not a collection of multiple traditions assumes that all black preaching stems from one place. Black preaching was birthed from the strange and odd encounter, there we go. Black preaching was birthed from the strange and odd encounter, traumatic encounter of European traditions and West African culture, but it was birthed in the tension of deep oppression and unforeseen overcoming of that oppression. Sometimes we like to talk about blackness as only signified by oppression, but it's also signified by triumph. And so, a constant overcoming, a constant push to get over. However, it's not simply one blend that then dissipated into all black religious spaces. Black people took their religion and contextualized it into their particular environments, particular denominations, and regional differences. In slave religion, Albert Robertson notes that even from the beginning, there was a northern style of preaching and a southern style. There was a formally educated strand of preaching and a folk strand of black preaching. There was a manuscript versus extempore. And those types of difference are not even regionally based anymore, as technology has continued, as movement has continued. But there's so much nuance across. Liturgist Melva Costin cautions us not to see black preaching or worship traditions as homogenous, because you miss the vastness of what they can be, and you also miss the reality of what binds them together. There are nuances between black Catholic and AME preacher, a Baptist preacher, and holiness traditions. The congregation and their style also affect the preaching because of the dialogical nature of preaching. All of these different components create a different style. Denominational differences, societal differences, and upbringing all create nuances for how one might enter and present in the pulpit. So black preaching is rooted in and lives in multiple preaching traditions. The second reality that I would like to lift is that black preaching is not dependent upon a particular performance. And I'll get to these 3 identities that you see on the screen. More often than not, it is solely characterized by this particular ecstatic performance involving hooping and a specific type of celebration. Now, I want to say, don't be embarrassed or highly critical of yourself if this is what you decided black preaching was. I just invite you to think of another thing now. It is a critique of the society that feeds us caricatures of truth in order to control a gaze for which people are looked upon. Honestly, there is truth that this is a unique aspect of black preaching. But to note that hooping and celebration is the sole criteria is when we go wrong. Different scholars have tried to move our vision beyond this simple idea of black preaching. I don't believe in just talking about what something is not, but I want to consider what actually binds it together. To move beyond solely evaluating performance, I rely heavily and really appreciate Kenyatta Gilbert's argument for the trivocal voice in the journey and promise of African American preaching. In this book, he argues that black preaching is the voice of the prophet, the priest, and the sage, all woven together. The prophet is the voice that speaks to issues of justice and does a lot of deconstructive work in the society we live in. The voice looks and calls forth the world beyond the one we currently live in. The priestly voice attends to the needs of a particular congregation, leaning into the pastoral presence of today with care, compassion, and intuition. The sagely voice, which is a reclaiming voice, brings forth wisdom, idioms, and understandings of the past. This voice comes in historical narratives that are as familiar as well as calls response techniques that draw the conversation, people into the conversation. Something like, won't he do it? With a response of, yes, she will. Or turn to your neighbor technique lie in the voice of the sage. It is something that the congregation can pull back from and reclaim and begin to speak to one another. These three voices find themselves uniquely intertwined in the voices of Black preachers. You hear the voice of the sage drawing from the depth of wisdom found in the common historical taproot of Black people. The stories of making a way out of no way. The stories of creating home in a society and a world who tried to make sure we could not even survive. Relating those stories to the biblical text and drawing forth the wisdom of the ancestors is tantamount in Black preaching. In Black preaching, it is the intertwining of these voices, reclaiming from the sage, carrying from the priest, and moving forward from the prophet that makes the preaching moment so powerful. Gilbert, alongside other scholars, focus on context while recognizing trends in performance, but allowing that not to be the sole criteria. They realize that delivery is not the only thing to consider when thinking through Black preaching. It is the complicated, unique, and robust narrative of Black people. So, Black preaching is rooted in multiple traditions. There's a common thread of the trivocal voice that looks different in different contexts. And finally, and this one is particularly important to me, Black preaching has major impact on preaching in general, in and well beyond predominantly Black church spaces. By lumping Black preaching traditions all into one small idea, people outside of the Black preaching tradition don't often see its efficacy within the larger context of preaching. Now, I put preaching in quotes because so often as we just talk about preaching, what we're really talking about is white preaching, specifically in an academy. And any other contextual preaching has a modifier in front of it. So Black modifying preaching, as opposed to everything that we talk about preaching having a modifier in front of it. It's important for us to realize that to name that all preaching is contextual and as multiple as we name and claim white preaching to be, as is all others. Black preaching has a core root that has grown an abundance of fruit that look different. In Black Preaching, the Recovery of a Powerful Art, Henry Mitchell makes an argument for the gifts that Black preaching offers all preaching traditions. Black preaching and its many traditions are not a silo or an island, but part of a larger preaching tradition and the history of preaching as a whole. The work and knowledge of Black preaching has informed popular speech well beyond Black preaching, yet it is often singled as something specifically for Black people. In the introduction of preaching in African American traditions, Frank Thomas chronicled the history of Black preaching and scholarship. So the first two eras that he named are separated by before Martin Luther King and then after Martin Luther King Jr. See, he argues that it was Martin Luther King Jr.'s preaching across media and the visual ability for the power of preaching to move people to action that brought this particular style of preaching to majority consciousness. I then argue that what is in majority consciousness often then becomes the defining traits. However, there's so many other ways of doing Black preaching. King's way of performing Black sacred rhetoric has been both replicated and rehearsed, but that does not mean that that is it. The current season of Black preaching traditions is more diverse than ever. There are still plenty of churches that are reminiscent of the folk and chant type of preaching that was birthed directly out of invisible institutions. There are also places where the emotive and charismatic expressions, as we would kind of assume that it looks like, are not present at all. Many Black churches find themselves somewhere in between these two extremes, and their preaching is reflective of that. In addition, the adage of televangelists, technological advances, and exponentially higher numbers of Black preachers with access to formal theological education continues to shape what Black preaching will look like. Like any preaching tradition, Black preaching traditions are innate to their context. While there are commonalities that tend to tie the larger umbrella together, it has never been and will never be one tradition. For me, what creates and binds the umbrella of Black preaching are historical taproot of trial and triumph, the trivocal voice of the sage, the prophet, and the priest, and the commitment to a God who advocates and sits on the side of the oppressed. So, That's the first window. So I'm gonna ask you a question. If this is true, if you buy into what I'm talking about, Black preaching is multiple, what do you say this window suggests about the Black church? This is, I'm asking for a response. I know my other ones have been just you writing down.
Say your three things again. Preferential option for the poor, trivocal, and what was the
Voice of the sage, and the taproot of trial and triumph. And also the larger things I talked about. So Black preaching as multiple traditions, stemming from multiple traditions. Black preaching as important to majority consciousness and as important to informing all of preaching. And also, then the voice of the sage, the priest, and the prophet.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for your question.
Sounds very rich in theology.
Rich in theology, certainly. Can you say more?
Just like drawing from all these different traditions. I'm sure some preachers draw from one tradition. I'm sure some draw from several. And then just living into the history of African American culture, and that tying into like formal education.
I like the word rich. Sounds like a lot. Rich in theology, robust in theology. Yes, thank you. Stringing different types of theology together. Absolutely. Thank you. Others?
I just appreciate the individuality that you suggest, that each minister brings themselves, that it's more than just about being Black, but it's about the individual as a whole, what their experiences are, their traditions, their upbringing, all of their wisdom and knowledge, everything that they bring, which Blackness also happens to be a part of that.
Absolutely. The voice of the individual is very important, and as it connects to the wider range. So it's the both and, right? It's the care for the singular and also the ways in which we are connected to a much wider cloud of witnesses, or as the preacher last night says, grandma and them. Did you have something?
I don't know if it's that much more, just that it's wide and deep and long and high, so it's so much more encompassing than a caricature or a smaller, narrower view, or even just a smaller exposure to Black preaching might be one thing. It's just everywhere, in everything.
Absolutely. I don't know if y'all know this, but churches are made of bodies, not bricks, right? And so it's a living and breathing place. And so it evolves, it changes, and even as it changes and evolves, there's still a history that carries. So it's a both and, right? It's what we're saying. It's the individual as connected to the community. It's the community as it supports the individual. It is the history as it moves us forward to the future and allows us to remain in the present. Which is like, whoa, that's so complicated. Yes, people are complicated. Life is complicated. Culture is complicated. But that does not mean that we can't expand and learn new things. Cool. So I think that we agree that Black preaching is multiple, right? Can we agree? Some of y'all, cool. A good amount. I feel fine. There's a few of us, there are a few witnesses in the room, so I feel okay. So now I would like to consider another window, another option. We're considering Black preaching through the history of Black women. What is the history of Black preaching? What does it mean to look through the eyes of Black women? Black women in America have been born into a world where woman has meant white woman and Black has meant men. Sitting in the intersection of these two marginal identities, Black women have a unique history and story in America. This history also affects the preaching history of Black women. A lot of the earlier books on Black preaching traditions talk about Black preaching, and they almost exclusively talk about Black men, with like a brief, like reference at the bottom to the reality of women's pulpit preaching at the times. Now, the argument is often that we don't have the data for women preachers, or there hasn't been enough study to make particular claims on preaching as a Black women as of yet. These are the earlier books. More recent works are quick down the moment of mentioning Black women, and there are a few, such as Word Throws a New Songs by Teresa Fry Brown, that really center the experience of Black women. So I argue that when you center Black women as preachers, you decenter the pulpit as the primary place that preaching happens. This then expands and evolves the places where we envision, where we have encountered Black preaching and preaching at large. You're probably wondering, why is she asking me where I've seen this? That's why. So that you can consider and envision the places where Black preaching can even occur. In The Gendered Pulpit, Roxanne Mountford argues that the pulpit is a masculinized space that has been used as a tool for silencing women, as opposed to affirming and supporting the call as equally as their male counterparts. The subversion of this pulpit has been done by uncovering and unleashing silenced voices, as well as expanding notions of what it means to preach, and of course, where it can be done. Other scholars have looked at the development of voice as a useful tool in women's preaching and offered metaphors, for example, preaching as testimony offered by Anna Carter Florence, or birthing the sermon as offered by your Dean Childers, to create space to consider how and what is particular about women's preaching and to consider other voices. This gendered pulpit doesn't make us consider other spaces, doesn't just make us consider other spaces, but it also greatly impacts women who decide to continue ministry from this location. There are actually damaging masculinizing effects or consequences related to the pulpit space, because space has memory. To have the audacity to stand in a space never created for your body requires effort, energy, and courage. In addition, women in the pulpit have often felt the need to mimic and or model after the men that they've experienced in order to feel validated in their speech. How whack is that you don't even feel like you're sorry? That's me coming up. That you don't even feel like your voice can speak power and truth and influence because of the ways in which this space has been told that you don't belong in it. So then, centering on Black women, what is the Black women's preaching tradition? So for me, 3 important things change when you tell the story of Black preaching through the eyes of Black women. When Black women are centered in preaching, there's a subversion of what we call the big chair syndrome. So as Teresa Fry Brown argues in Weary Throats and New Songs, the major subversion is to the big chair syndrome, the I'm awesome syndrome because I can sit in this chair and preach from this pulpit, this sacred desk. The big chair syndrome is the centrality of power from one place in the church. For Black preaching, this is major. See, when preaching is no longer defined by the pulpit, the sacred desk, how might it be defined? To answer this question, I refer to my aforementioned discussion of Black preaching that we just talked about, and I also include John McClure's 4 Codes of Preaching. In this, yes, awesome. In this, he outlines 4 categories that are required in a sermon. He's also my advisor, so I nuance it and argue with it a little bit, but it's okay. He knows I do this. These categories are scripture, or what I'm calling sacred text, theology, the message, and culture/experience. It's the combination of these things that lead us into the genre of preaching, not a piece of furniture, not the big chair. Cheryl Townsend Gilkson, If It Wasn't for the Women, and Evelyn Higginbotham in Righteous Discontent both offer accounts of club women and educators who have prolific careers in organizing as well as speaking. I had to make sure that I was right. I am. We actually have lots of archival materials of many of their words, which are engaging in the trivocal voice, deeply tapped into the historical taproot of Black people, and exhibiting the combination of McClure's 4 codes, yet not commonly considered preachers. Excluded from the pulpit in their time, they carved and created spaces for others to preach as well. For Black women, preaching was in and beyond the pulpit. For Black women, preaching is in and beyond the pulpit. Preachers, using my definition, were political speakers and activists. They were educators, writers, singers, artists, and of course, your pulpit preachers. Women like Maria Stewart, Sojourner Truth, Fannie Lou Hamer, Virginia Trout, Annie Helen Burroughs, Alice Walker, Gloria Naylor, Zora Neale Hurston, Mahalia Jackson, just to name a few, because right, we don't have all day, right? But this redefining does not just give us different preachers to consider from the past, but it makes us wonder about the possibility of who in our contemporary world might be included in our preaching canon as well. So for me, as a result of the pulpit being gendered, it only makes sense to consider that maybe this pulpit, which has never been a space of ultimate inclusion, acceptance, and uplift for all voices, might not be the only place where we should study preaching. Sure, Homiletics has talked about other places of proclamation, but my question is, what do we benefit from calling some things proclamation and other things preaching if they're all doing the preaching thing? Another lecture again. I believe that it is preaching as defined by the pulpit. When you look through the eyes of Black women, the pulpit is a part of it, but it is not the whole story. So we're subverting the big chair syndrome. Secondly, when Black women are centered, there's an inextricable link to the practice of the prophetic tradition, not simply radical rhetoric. There is a difference between radical rhetoric and prophetic proclamation. Let me tell you what it is, from me. You can argue if you like, that's why there's a question and answer session. Radical rhetoric is the litany of ills, right? It is the words that make the crowd go, woo, that was good to me. But prophetic proclamation includes that, and then gives a function to go forth and do the thing, and also includes that as the preacher, you are also doing the thing. So don't preach about what you don't plan to do. And maybe shudder to preach about what you haven't tried to do, but that's, you can do what you like to do. That's the difference between radical rhetoric for me and prophetic proclamation. So when talking about Black women's sacred speech, Black women's preaching, whether discussing pulpit preaching or preaching beyond the pulpit, the prophetic tradition is at the forefront. In Can I Get a Witness, womanist Marcia Riggs argues that Black women's speech is aligned with the prophetic tradition in 3 ways. They are aligned with the biblical prophets, subverting the norms and any type of injustice. They are also aligned with the standard Black prophetic tradition, advocating for God of the oppressed and for the flourishing of the entire Black community. Finally, they align their prophetic voice with a call and conversion experience that often invoked and sparked their call. See, when everyone's telling you no, sometimes you need spirit to show up and just say, no, you are indeed called. But I would add an additional category, which is the practice of the prophetic that I just described. See, as I began to comb through some of these women, I realized that their practice was just as strong as their proclamation. Dare I say their preaching actually came from their practice. Educators spoke of a world where Black children would receive the same education as their white counterparts, and also work to raise the money so that would come into play. Activists spoke at their keynotes and then showed up and organized protests and did the hard and gritty work that is not as cute from the pulpit. In the afterword of Can I Get a Witness, Marcia Riggs asked, will the circle be unbroken? Will Black women continue to live and move as a prophetic presence in and beyond the pulpit? To me, the answer is obvious, yes. From activists to performers to nonprofit organizers to church mothers, the interwoven nature of theology, message, culture, and scripture is found in so many places, and it is rooted in the prophetic tradition. So we're subverting the big chair syndrome, one. We're rooted in the prophetic tradition. And finally, when Black women's preaching is centered, our hermeneutical lens is expanded and enhanced. In Katie's canon, womanist pioneer Katie Cannon talks explicitly about homiletics, offering what she calls a womanist critique of preaching. In her work, Cannon argues that we have to move beyond wilderness, whimpering Hagar, sin bringing Eve, and all of the negative tropes that have followed women into contemporary life. These are not simply shallow reads of the text, but oppressive readings from the gaze of the privileged, even if they are reinforced by those that are marginalized. She argues that preaching needs to have expansive language for God and read women in the text beyond the sinfulness that is traditionally attributed to them. Womanist biblical interpretation has continued at hard work, which allows for homiletics to do the work that it does. As a result of Cannon's work, womanist homileticians, Cannon's work and other womanist biblical interpreter work, womanist homileticians have created typologies for what homiletics from a womanist perspective should include or pay attention to. In Towards a Womanist Homiletic, Dominic Allen builds off the work of Clarice Martin and Katie Cannon to posit an extended set of criteria for the ones that she pulls from Cannon's work. Allen believes that womanism should focus solely on powerful rhetoric. As a result, she adds a few things to Cannon's list of criteria, which include but are not limited to a focus on Jesus' life and humanity, not just his gender, special attention to the way we talk about sexuality and making sure that it's not oppressive, and continually expanding our ways of naming God. More recent wave of womanist homiletics is looking at what might be different methods and also surprising considerations for what constitute preachers. Homileticians such as Dr. Lisa Thompson, Dr. Melva Sampson, Dr. Danielle McCrae, and myself are working on this work to consider what happens when you center Black women. This window into the Black church centers Black women, which reorients the story. Black church becomes less signified by the frenzy and more understood through the lens of powerful witness at its best. It becomes multiple, beyond four walls, and certainly beyond a piece of furniture or any ignorant rhetoric that has been used to demonize any people group. So again, I ask you the same question I asked before. If this is true, what do you say this window that's centering Black women, suggests about the Black church?
Suggest maybe that
Please.
It suggests that, for example, you talked about the Hagar narratives and how those are oppressive. It suggests that if you break the systems that keep Black women down within the church, then you set everybody free. In a way.
So that preaching can be a place of liberation, right?
For
Can be a place,
everyone. Right.
for everyone. So when you allow Black women to be edified and celebrated and not have to fight through so much muck and miry about what the text is saying about them, perhaps that opens up the gate for more. I hear you.
I would even suggest that the church itself would benefit greatly from the power that a Black woman brings, as opposed to having this sort of condescending attitude about women, like we're doing women such a great favor by bringing them into the pulpit. Let's say, let's benefit from this
Yes.
power that we have here and all grow from it.
Right. I'm going to reflect back what I heard you say, but use my words.
Okay.
When you center Black women, you realize it does not even make sense, the type of fake hierarchy that we've created,
Yeah.
where men are here and
Yeah.
women are, given, just enough space in the pulpit for Women's Day,
Yeah.
or maybe Children's Day, right?
Right.
You realize that actually all of the voices that feel this call, this invoking, this movement have something to offer. So when you shut it down, it's not just shutting down, via like doctors and stuff. You are actually squelching a person's ability to be all that they feel and called and created to be, which is not what we're trying to do at all. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, please.
So I think there's like a parallel analysis between preaching and the church. So if you're taking preaching beyond the pulpit and looking at it beyond the pulpit, then you need to look at the church beyond, as you said, the four walls.
Definitely. Absolutely. Please look at the church beyond the four walls, because it just has to happen. Like, if you think about what church is for you, and for when I think about what the Black church has been for me, Black church has been a place certainly where I go to worship, where I go to be fed, where I go to engage and grow, but the Black church has been family for me. It's been community. I have so many aunts and uncles that I'm like, am I related to them? I don't know. Because of the community that I grew up in. And so for a young Black girl who was trying to figure herself out in a world that was like, you're too much this, you look like this, you're whatever, to go into a space that was holding me and cultivating me and telling me that I was so dope, allowed for me to have an armor and also a swag when I entered out into these other spaces. Because I was like, oh, what you're telling me is lies, because I've already gotten the truth. And so it creates a beyond the four walls. And those spaces didn't just happen at, in pulpits and stuff. They happen at kitchen tables and outside, on parks and all types of things. And so that building of the expansive church, absolutely, that's what happens when you decenter the pulpit.
I have a question, actually.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, I'm interested in your suggestion that focusing on Black women, focusing on women in general is about taking preaching outside of the pulpit. Do you think that there's and then going off of this comment you're talking about swag, do you think that there's the focusing on centering women, centering Black women in particular, leads to a liturgics of day-to-day movements?
Yes. And so I want to also, hearing your question, I want to say it's in and beyond the pulpit. So I'm not trying to remove the pulpit. First of all, it's going to be a lot of work. Secondly, I think that there is some worth and efficacy in the pulpit, right? But when it becomes the sole place of power, and sole place of influence, and sole place where we think preaching can happen, that's when I think it becomes problematic. And then to answer your second question, absolutely. So I think of preaching and liturgy pretty much the same, together all the time. And I do think that there's a movement of the patterns of what happens beyond these non-pulpit preaching spaces Now, I don't have a detailed answer for you because I'm starting to look at it, but I do absolutely believe that there are patterns of the rituals and the things that occur around that might look different than what happens in pulpit spaces, and I think that's good, right? Because when we can grasp onto different areas to receive power, then we can actually have it, right? We don't have to just depend on this one siloed space for the influence from the text. Did that answer your question? Okay, cool. I want to make sure. All right. Cool. So, if you're not already into why this matters, I think you are, because based on our conversation, you seem like you believe it matters. I'm happy to name it for you. When we first began, I asked you to consider how you knew what Black preaching was. The reality is most understandings are from experience of one place or maybe one or two. When a group is marginalized, we tend to conflate that group into one thing, one style, one understanding, because unless you live as that particular group, you only have to learn what you want. Black preaching does not just affect Black churches, just like Black churches do not solely affect Black people. An understanding of Black preaching affects how you understand rhetoric, the public performance of Blackness, and also the possibility of what can be embodied in the Black church. In addition, considering the history of Black preaching doesn't just reshape how we orient and redefine Black church, it invites us to consider how we define preaching and church as a whole. By shifting the perspective to look through the lens of Black women, possibilities open up. The work of these two windows was to give a different look, a different narrative than the dominant or mainstream one, to offer more texture to the definition and invite each of us to think twice before limiting Black preaching to a simple definition. So I went back and forth about whether or not to give you videos and all the stuff to hype up the presentation or whatever, so we could like look at all these different churches. I even talked to your professor about it, thinking back and forth, but however, I realized that what I'm talking about is being lived in this 3-night revival here on your campus. You have 3 different Black preachers, 3 different styles, 3 different ways of preaching, 3 different contexts, ways of knowing, yet all Black preaching. So if you haven't, I invite you, and I hope to see you all tonight, because I will certainly be there, to consider what you heard today as you listen tonight. To consider what you heard today as you reflect on what you heard yesterday, if you were there last night. And again, what ties it all together? I refer back to the trivocal voice, this strain of 3 chords that shows up in different ways, through different people, in different places and platforms. There are many windows that one can explore into the Black church. However, I hope the ones that I listed today have made you think about the ways you define Black preaching and also what you consider preaching to be in general. If recognizing the multiplicity of Black preaching makes you uncomfortable and you feel the need to push back, ask questions all you want, but really push back, I would ask yourself why it makes you uncomfortable. If preaching beyond the pulpit makes you feel uncomfortable or like it can't be, ask yourself the why, because this is the hard work of how we grow and learn together. I'm going to close this time of the lecture leads as my dear mentor, Dale P. Andrews, always closed. He says, I have more questions than I have answers. I have more problems than I have solutions. But it is from these gifts that I freely share. Thank you for listening. Amen.